Who is Volodymyr Zelenskyy? Zelenskyy is a mixed character, and honestly it's not very easy to sum him up in a nutshell, but we all know that he is the 44-year-old president of Ukraine, often denigrated by his detractors as a mere comedian. But it turns out, certainly as I've gone through all the detail on this man, that whether he is good or bad, one thing I have learned is that he is a smart cookie. He is no fool. He grew up in a neighbourhood known as Quarter 95, which he and others have described as a city of bandits. Nonetheless, he studied law and he has a law degree. During university, he got involved in acting and comedy, and ultimately he started his own production company called Studio Quarter 95, named after where he grew up, which became phenomenally successful. Perhaps their biggest success, which entrenched Zelenskyy as a household name in Ukraine, was a TV show called Servant of the People, which premiered in October 2015. His wife of 18 years is the show's writer, and in it, Zelenskyy is cast as a history teacher who became a viral internet sensation after a student filmed him delivering an impassioned tirade against official corruption. The history teacher goes on to be, believe it or not, elected president of Ukraine. That's the plot of the show. And that is kind of what happened to Zelenskyy himself in the real world, not just in his character. Studio Quarter 95, the company that produced this documentary just about was, that produced this show, registered the political party Servant of the People, named after the show, or SOP, in 2018, and Zelenskyy then announced his candidacy for president. And he was the instant front runner. He was elected in a landslide on the 31st of March 2019 with 73% of the vote, which is quite enormous. His platform was overtly and avowedly reformist, with a major focus on fighting corruption. That's why the show was so popular in the first place. It's all about anti-corruption, and it's also why then his candidacy was so popular, because that was the theme of his whole campaign, along with supporting Ukraine's membership of the EU and NATO. Zelenskyy's party, the SOP, Servant of the People, went on to win 254 of 450 seats in the Ukrainian parliamentary elections, which gave a single party an absolute majority for the first time in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. And it's a unicameral parliament, I understand, so that's tremendous power. Zelenskyy was successful as a seeming political novice and an outsider due to the public appetite to fight corruption and initiate reform. His campaign was unorthodox. It contained very few substantive policies and relied heavily on social media. It's got massive followings and comedic content as well. His party, the SOP, Servant of the People, initially described itself as libertarian, which gave it a very predictable philosophy, which is effectively free markets and liberal social policy, lots of freedom. But it has recently recast itself as a centrist party, which makes me suspicious. I'm always suspicious of parties that claim to be centrist because they simply never are. They use the label to win the widest possible support, but they invariably fall on the left or the right in practice. So that kind of remains to be seen. Here are some highlights from the SOP's official policy platform. 1. Abolishing legal immunity for MPs. Actually, I don't have numbers, so I won't number these. But abolishing legal immunity for MPs. Create a mechanism for the people to be able to veto recently adopted legislation. Decentralise power. Make it possible for media owners to influence what journalists say. Make it impossible, for media owners to influence what journalists say. Introduce referendums. A complete clean-up and relaunch of the prosecutor's office. Mandatory confiscation of corrupt officials' property. Defence spending set at a minimum of 5% of GDP. The modernisation of the military according to NATO standards. Expand cooperation with the EU and with NATO. Reduce court fees. That's an access to justice thing. Introduction of witness protection. Introduction of legal gun ownership. Protect human rights and fundamental freedoms for men and women in Ukraine. So there's some key things. Before I get into some of the details, like the two major ones there, just to comment on Zelenskyy's religion, he's very cagey on the subject, actually. He's not a practicing Jew, and he has said that his family was not religious growing up. He said a couple of interesting things, however. He said he believes in God, and speaking with the Times of Israel, he said this, quote, "I had one attitude when I was a boy and another now. I never speak about religion and I never speak about God because I have my own personal opinion about it. Of course, I believe in God, but I speak with him only in those moments which are personal for me and important and where I feel comfortable in those places." In another interview, he says this. This was with a Ukrainian media outlet, I believe. "In general, on the topic of religion, there are things that we never discuss at the table in my family. That's how my father taught me. I never discuss them with anyone. Religion is number one. We never discuss things that divide families and society. I never do it. Never. But I believe in God, if that's the question." So it probably betrays a poor appreciation of the connection between belief in God, what God is like, and the actions that we actually undertake in secular life as it's become known, and other spheres. So it's this privatization, this reducing of religion to a box. So certainly it's had no discernible impact on his acting and his comedy, which were at times very risque, very foul-mouthed, very sexualized, and actually anti-religion at times. That's his religion side. Back to the policies. Two things I'll go through. Firstly, NATO and the EU, very briefly, and then just a couple of his anti-corruption moves, which have been interesting. Firstly, NATO and the EU. Putin has actually singled out Zelensky's pro-NATO and pro-EU efforts as a major excuse for his invasion of Ukraine, and this is pretty well known now. Ukraine has, under Zelensky's presidency, been recognised as a NATO Enhanced Opportunities partner. In other words, there's greater sharing of information, there's sharing of military exercises and things like that. This has got Putin nervous, so Putin says. That's a status, equal opportunities partner is a status that Australia also has, because we're of course not in the North Atlantic, but we have that status with NATO, and also Finland, Georgia, Jordan and Sweden. But since the invasion, Zelensky has changed his tune, probably because he has to. He said, regarding NATO, I have cooled down regarding this question long ago after we understood that NATO is not prepared to accept Ukraine. The alliance is afraid of controversial things and confrontation with Russia. I never wanted to be a country which is begging something on its knees. We are not going to be that country. I don't want to be that president. So he's cooled right down on NATO. He has to for the sake of the present conflict. The thing that is particularly interesting is this anti-corruption side of his presidency. Pardon me, this anti-corruption side of his presidency. According to Zelensky, this is why he got into politics. It certainly was the overwhelming theme of his campaign. His progress has, to say the least, been mixed. There's an anti-oligarch law, which he has passed. There's a law which takes away immunity for politicians, which has passed. And there's illicit enrichment in the criminal code, which has passed. On the anti-oligarch law, Zelensky sort of was big on the whole oligarch thing at the start. He said there can be no other option but to dismantle the oligarch system. Without this, it is simply impossible to overcome poverty in Ukraine and fully join the European community. He also said this, quote, I do not want us to have oligarchs. That's why I know that during my term we will get rid of all the oligarchs. I gave such a word and I'm going to do it. Now, the law passed in November 2021, and this is what it does. It's an anti-oligarch law. It, 1, creates a register of oligarchs. 2, requires public officials to disclose their contact with oligarchs. 3, excludes oligarchs from political funding, so they're not allowed to fund political parties, political advertising, and so on. It excludes oligarchs from media ownership, and it excludes oligarchs from participating in state asset privatisation tenders. But the law is very, very vague, and when I looked at it first, it really made me wonder. I thought this thing is a toothless tiger and open to abuse. It just was immediately obvious. If this was an Australian piece of legislation, I'd be up in arms. And it seems that I'm not alone. Another Ukrainian MP, Kira Ruddick, has written this. The measures required in order to genuinely limit power in Ukraine's oligarch clans are well known. These include the creation of an independent judiciary, strengthening of antitrust laws and antitrust authorities, corporate governance reform in the public sector, elimination of tax benefits for big businesses, and greater transparency in media funding. There is nothing to indicate that the present Ukrainian authorities plan to implement any of these steps. Instead, they appear to have chosen populist anti-oligarch posturing as a tool to tackle political opponents, while at the same time maintaining or even strengthening relations with favoured oligarch clans. The Office of the President has created deliberately vague anti-oligarch legislation that does not contain any objective steps to limit oligarch influence. Instead, it enables the National Security and Defence Council, which is personally appointed by the President, to determine who is an oligarch and who should face restrictions on owning media or participating in the political life of the country. I mean, that is rife for abuse. So the President appoints this body. The body gets to choose who's an oligarch, put them on the register, and completely defang them in all politics and media, whereas it doesn't necessarily have to put anyone on the list. David Clark, former UK Foreign Office Advisor, has said, recent developments illustrate why many remain sceptical about talk of an anti-oligarch crusade. As soon as the anti-oligarch bill was signed into law by President Zelensky in early November, former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko immediately sold his media assets. Nevertheless, a number of MPs from Zelensky's own Servant of the People party argued that this would not prevent Poroshenko from being identified as an oligarch due to uncertainties with the application of the new law. So they're intending to go after Poroshenko, who's a political opponent of Zelensky. Notably, says Clark, other oligarchs with large media empires who enjoy friendlier relations with Zelensky did not seem at all bothered by the new legislation. Due to the obvious potential for highly subjective and politically motivated application, I regard Ukraine's anti-oligarch legislation as a power grab disguised in the language of political populism. More importantly, it can be used to attack Zelensky's political opponents. I must say, I think all that criticism is very valid on the face of things. It's not a great law. Second, and I do read a lot of laws for a living, so yeah, it's not a great law. Very quickly, three things that have been a little bit more successful. The immunity law. This is interesting. There has been a constitutional amendment under Zelensky's term which dropped the guarantee of parliamentary immunity and removed the rule that parliamentarians can only be prosecuted, detained or arrested by approval of the parliament. But, and there's a big but, all legal proceedings against members of parliament must now be approved by the Prosecutor General. So the obvious concern that arises is the integrity of the whole system depends on the integrity of the Prosecutor General. And that person's politics and allegiance may affect their judgment. So that's a concern there, although I think maybe it is a net improvement, I think. This one is an improvement. Illicit enrichment has been added as an offence to Ukraine's criminal code. And it means that officials with assets they cannot explain worth more than $250,000 face 5 years in jail. And for values below $250,000, the assets can be seized, and that law has been widely welcomed. A couple of worrying signs about Zelenskyy, if there wasn't any in what I just said, there probably was. But a couple of worrying signs that are particularly key is that he's been pressured big time by the US and the EU to pursue the LGBT agenda in Ukraine and also to really get big on climate change and climate action policy. And he's responded, at least to some degree, to that pressure. There's currently a law before the Parliament to outlaw, for example, quote, open, prejudiced, negative attitudes towards, unquote, but then it lists people on the basis of various attributes, including sexual orientation, gender identity. Now, that sounds lovely as a motherhood statement, but we in the West know just how badly such vague laws are abused and used to attack and suppress any kind of thinking or conviction which is at odds with LGBTQ politics and thinking. There's also a partnership with the US for climate action, and Zelenskyy also favours legal abortion, medical marijuana, prostitution, and has liberalised the gambling industry. In his words, quote, to be honest, you need to climb into the freedom of a person less. And I guess that the irony in that is that these things actually enslave people. You know, freedom, yeah, from a libertarian point of view, but there's no freedom in any of that. There is an important point to make about corruption. There are questions about Zelenskyy's links to corruption, and it wouldn't be a complete segment if I didn't mention this. The main one relates to a guy called Ihor Kolomoisky. I hope I'm saying that right. But one of his business partners, one of Zelenskyy's business partners this is, and he is an oligarch. And Kolomoisky is accused of stealing $5.5 billion from Ukraine's largest lender and fleeing the country, where he had been living in self-imposed exile for a long time. Zelenskyy announced his run for president on Kolomoisky's television network, which then supported him extensively with media coverage and by running his shows. And Kolomoisky returned to Ukraine when Zelenskyy was elected president. And then came this investigation by hundreds of investigative journalists all over the world called the Pandora Papers. This was a leak of millions of documents from offshore tax havens revealing secret bank accounts, offshore companies, private jets, yachts, mansions, art collections, all with concealed ownership structures, all part of an enterprise of money laundering and tax evasion. 35 current and former world leaders are implicated in the Pandora Papers, plus 300 other public officials and politicians. More come from Ukraine, over 30, than any other country by far. The reason Australians may not have heard about this is because no Australians were implicated. Basically, the allegations are that Zelenskyy's business partners include Ukraine's current head of the SBU, which is Ukraine's main intelligence agency which investigates many corruption cases, and a presidential aide who administers the offshore companies and apparently shares the profits with Zelenskyy's wife, and also with Kolomoisky himself, the big oligarch. That's kind of the irony. There are companies with links to Zelenskyy in the British Virgin Islands, Belize and Cyprus, dating back to 2012, which is the approximate start of Zelenskyy's relationship with Kolomoisky. There are $40 million worth of money transfers revealed by these papers between Zelenskyy and his associates and Kolomoisky, and the implication is that these funds, it's very hard to explain them, it's very hard to understand them, apart from a money laundering enterprise, which seems to be, in the whole scheme of the Pandora Papers and all the different people involved, one of the things that's going on. The upshot of all of this is that the breadcrumbs are there, but not enough to give conclusive proof of wrongdoing. Zelenskyy doesn't deny any of the connections. He doesn't deny the companies. He doesn't deny the business partners, but he denies any personal involvement or involvement by Quarter 95, you remember his production company, in money laundering. Now, there is people who say, well, this is business in Ukraine. This is the way that things are done there. This is the way tax evasion and putting things offshore. There's all sorts of reasons for doing it, and it is cultural and it's practice. Or indeed, there is connection to what the papers reveal at large, which could be money laundering, at least tax evasion, So there are questions like that, and there's a couple of other, people will know about Burisma and Hunter Biden and stuff like that as well. There's things like that everywhere, and Ukraine seems to have a bit of a corruption problem. How close is Zelenskyy to it? Maybe closer than he made out when he was running for president, but it doesn't necessarily definitely prove that he's up to his eyeballs in it. It may be that he's just rubbing shoulders with people who are. One cannot deny this, however. I said at the start, he's not an easy guy to sum up. Is he good? Is he bad? Pretty hard, to make a clear call one way or the other. But one can't deny this much, and I kind of respect him for this much as I don't respect a lot of the other stuff. He has been a remarkable leader in the war effort. He's won the world's support, he's put Ukraine on the map, he's shown great bravery, he's stayed in Kiev with his family, he is the target of the Russians, he has led his country, therefore, in a spirited military defense. He's won more support and more assistance from the global community than Ukraine would otherwise have gotten, and he's won the propaganda war. The effectiveness of his leadership, I think, has been astonishing. I respect his bravery, which has been quite astonishing as well. And I respect what Ukraine has been able to do, which has been against the odds and quite astonishing to protect their country. Time magazine kind of hypes it up just a bit and says that he altered the course of history. Let's say that he altered the course of things dramatically at the outbreak of war, and it is summarised relatively fairly as follows. The change, that is the change in the global community's support attitude, was not instantaneous. Western leaders were still divided two ways after the invasion. When they met to agree on a package of sanctions to punish Russia for its attack, Germany, Hungary and Italy initially wanted to water down these measures. Then Zelenskyy dialed into their meeting. Calm but determined, his face pale, covered with stubble, he told the leaders of the free world that this might be the last time they would see him alive. "The enemy has marked me as target number 1, he said in a video statement shortly after the call. "My family is target number 2. Yet Zelenskyy decided to stay in his capital, an act of courage that has already altered the course of history. It roused the US and its allies to impose unprecedented penalties against Russia, crashing the ruble and unplugging much of its economy from the rest of the world. Germany decided to pour more than $100 billion into its military, casting aside a post-war tradition of pacifism that has long frustrated allies. Switzerland broke from its tradition of neutrality to support sanctions. The EU agreed to put Ukraine on a path to membership, shedding decades of internal resistance." Now that is actually all quite astonishing. And it is largely due to Zelenskyy's wartime leadership. So overall, hard to know what to think. I said I'd do the segment, so I did. And I'd have to say, yeah, a great wartime leader. Possibly not the most moral of leaders, however. I'm Mark Niles, and that was the truth of it.